Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. Let's start with that breaking news in the Middle East, with the region on a knife edge, because reports from the US say Israel has notified the US it intends to launch a limited ground incursion into Lebanon. CBS, the BBC's partners in America, say they were told by an official that the incursion could start as soon as today. In the past hour, President Biden has said he is opposed to any ground invasion. The Israeli Defense Minister had said that the next phase of the war against Hezbollah will begin soon. That was the quote he used in the last few minutes. Well, earlier in the day, he visited the Lebanese border, where he said Israel was ready to use forces from air, sea and land to achieve its objectives and ensure people who'd been evacuated from their homes in northern Israel were safe to return. Well, Hezbollah's deputy leader has insisted that the group is ready if Israel decides to invade Lebanon. In a defiant speech, he said the battle against Israel will continue. And in a separate development, Lebanon's Prime Minister said he's ready to deploy the country's army to defend the border area if needed. So let's take stock of where we are tonight. Let's speak to our correspondents, John Donaldson in Jerusalem, Tom Bateman in Washington and Anna Foster in Beirut. And to John, first of all. And John, all the indicators point to this ground incursion, this ground invasion starting pretty soon.
Yeah, that's right. The Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, as you were saying, suggesting it could happen as soon as today. So that's really within the next few hours. I think the big question is, what will this ground incursion involve? We understand that already some Israeli special forces have been into Lebanon, carrying out intelligence operations, possibly dismantling some tunnels and infrastructure. But I think the question is, to what extent are the Israelis going to push into southern Lebanon? How deep are they going to go? Are they going to stay there and try to occupy some territory, or are they going to be going in and crossing back over into Israel? But none of those things are clear at the moment, but it definitely seems like they are going to move to the next phase of the operation, as Mr. Gallant said.
Let's cross to Tom Bateman. He's there in Washington. Tom, we were listening to President Biden and he was asked about exactly this, and he was still saying that he wanted a ceasefire. So there is, again, real tension between the US administration that is constantly talking about de-escalation and an Israeli Prime Minister that, again, is making a move that escalates the situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, President Biden was asked how much he knew about these reports of a limited ground operation starting soon, and also what he made of that. Now, he said that he knew more than the reporter thought, and that he was comfortable with them stopping this. And then, as you say, called for a ceasefire once again. So, you know, a clear sign from the US president that he is not comfortable with the way things are unfolding on the ground once again. But what we have seen throughout this is the same pattern, the same dynamic, in that we've seen US pressure applied diplomatically on the Israelis to try and pull back. You know, that was at its most acute last week, during a week of the United Nations General Assembly, where the Americans were leading a diplomatic charge, calling for a truce between Israel and Hezbollah, calling for mediated talks, calling for them to pull back from the brink. And we saw the absolute rejection of that by Benjamin Netanyahu last week, you know, within 24 hours of the Americans making the call. And some officials were briefing to expect the Israelis to release a statement that will warm to this ceasefire, effectively welcoming it. And what we saw in action was the complete opposite. You know, that vivid image of Benjamin Netanyahu authorising the strike on Hassan Nasrallah from his hotel room in New York. So I think the Americans have got a pretty clear sign of the degree to which Benjamin Netanyahu is listening to them on this. And not only the fact that what's happening on the ground is moving away from American pressure, but also they're then having to effectively welcome the results of the Israeli actions, because, of course, we've had from across the administration, from the president downwards, them welcoming the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the president pointing out that Hezbollah was responsible for the killing and kidnapping of many Americans in the past. So they welcome that, but they're at the same time privately extremely concerned about this extremely sharp escalation. And I think that's why we're again seeing President Biden saying they should stop. There should be a ceasefire. But I think events on the ground are clearly now out of the control of the Americans.
Tom, thank you. Let's go to Beirut and to Anna Foster. And Anna, all of these reports about the ground incursion possibly starting in the next couple of hours. And of course, that is what so many people in Lebanon have been fearing for a very long time, a ground move by the Israelis.
That's right, Matthew. And that's why you've seen tens of thousands of people leave that southern area of Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley as well in the east. The places that Israel now has been conducting airstrikes for over a week. They said they were doing that to prepare the ground. They told their soldiers in the north of Israel they were doing that to prepare the ground for a possible ground invasion. That they were targeting, they said, places where Hezbollah stored their weapons, places where they were able to launch their weapons from. So we've seen this huge internal displacement inside Lebanon already, but also this huge fear about what might happen next. You remember 2006, the war then. Of course, there were places here in Beirut, pieces of specific infrastructure that were targeted, things like roads and bridges. Also, the airport here in Beirut as well was targeted. Now, interestingly, we know a couple of days ago that Israel, they said that they were concerned that Hezbollah would try and bring in new weapons via the airport. And in fact, at one stage, there was an Iranian civilian flight which was on its way here, which was turned around again after Israel sort of got in touch and said that they would use force if the plane tried to land. So that went back to Iran, and Iran Air subsequently cancelled the rest of its flights, which was something that other commercial airliners had already done. Just picking up on what Tom was saying there, obviously there are many displaced Lebanese here in the country already, but there are also nationals of other countries too. I was seeing something on social media earlier that was directed at US citizens that were still in the country. They were able to register, it said, to try and buy flights on extra planes, buy seats on extra flights that the US would try and sort of put on to get people out of the country. Similarly, the UK has been asking its citizens to leave. Other countries as well have. Flights on planes are almost, seats on planes are almost impossible to get at the moment. And of course, if something happens at the airport, if the airport is taken out of action by Israel as part of any ground invasion, then that will mean that there are a lot of people who are stuck in Lebanon who won't be able to get out. So you would think that sort of Western nations, the US, the UK, will be considering that as well right now in the conversations that they are having, as we were hearing there, as they try to de-escalate what looks at the moment like a very fast-moving situation with plenty of Israeli momentum behind it.
And Anna, Hezbollah's deputy leader right at the start of the day put out a statement saying that Hezbollah was ready if Israel were to launch a ground invasion. I suppose the question that we don't know is, given everything we've seen over the last couple of weeks, do they have the capacity to cause real damage to the Israeli forces if they come across the border?
Exactly right, Matthew. And before this, all the indications were that they did, because they are, of course, armed and backed and financed by Iran. And the kind of weapons that Hezbollah had here in Lebanon were very different to the type that Hamas had, that they used in southern Israel. Hezbollah was sort of fully believed to have weapons that could target the whole of Israel, that would be a real threat to people living throughout the country. What we don't know is how many of those are left. We don't know how many of their personnel are left. We don't know how much Israel has managed to degrade what Hezbollah has with its strikes. And that is why Iran is starting to come into the mix. You saw earlier today Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, making this speech to Iranians about regime change. Now, of course, people in Iran won't see that, because media in Iran, of course, is so carefully controlled. So that was a message that Benjamin Netanyahu was realistically sending to his own Israeli people, but to the wider world as well, I think. If Iran decided to step in at this point and help Hezbollah out in Lebanon, that is the fear that everybody has had. You know, that wider regional conflict that has been talked about for so many months now. I think that is the concern. If Hezbollah can't defend itself here in Lebanon, which of the other Iranian proxies in the region might or might not step in to help?
Anna, thanks very much. Well, you bring me on to exactly where I wanted to end up. Let me just tell viewers that Yemen's Houthis have just said they will escalate their military operations in response to the Israeli attacks over the weekend. Anna talking about that statement that Benjamin Netanyahu made a little earlier, directing it directly at the people in Iran. I'll ask John Donaldson about that in a moment. But first, let's play what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say.
I want to address you, the people of Iran. I want to do so directly, without filters, without middlemen. Every day, you see a regime that subjugates you make fiery speeches about defending Lebanon, defending Gaza. Yet every day, that regime plunges our region deeper into darkness and deeper into war. Every day, their puppets are eliminated. Ask Mohammed Deif. Ask Nasrallah. There is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach. There's nowhere we will not go to protect our people and protect our country. With every passing moment, the regime is bringing you, the noble Persian people, closer to the abyss. The vast majority of Iranians know their regime doesn't care a whit about them. If it did care, if it cared about you, it would stop wasting billions of dollars on futile wars across the Middle East. It would start improving your lives. Imagine if all the vast money the regime wasted on nuclear weapons and foreign wars were invested in your children's education, in improving your health care, in building your nation's infrastructure, water, sewage, all the other things that you need. Imagine that. But you know one simple thing. Iran's tyrants don't care about your future, but you do. When Iran is finally free, and that moment will come a lot sooner than people think, everything will be different.
Well, that was Benjamin Netanyahu in the last couple of hours. Let's go back to John Donaldson, who's in Jerusalem. John, that was interesting, but I read out that line about the Houthis from Yemen saying they will escalate their military operations in response to what we saw from the Israelis. What are you hearing about how comfortable the military is fighting, in effect, on three fronts? They're fighting Hamas, they're fighting Hezbollah, they're fighting the Houthis.
I think they're pretty comfortable at the moment, to be honest. They clearly feel, the Israelis, that they've got the wind in their sails at the moment. They've got a bit of momentum. You're right, the war in Gaza, of course, is still ongoing, but the focus now very much on the northern border. And one thing I'd point out is that the Israeli public is much more united in its support for the operations against Hezbollah than it is for the war in Gaza, where there are a lot of divisions within the public, within the government, in fact, over policy in Gaza. Many hostage families, of course, not happy that the government hasn't prioritised more a ceasefire and hostage release deal. When it comes to Hezbollah, I think there is overwhelming public support for what Mr. Netanyahu is doing. And you're right, we have had these drones and missiles being launched from Yemen targeting Israel, but Israel hits back hard, as we saw yesterday with those strikes on one of Yemen's main ports and two power stations. So I think Israel's military is feeling relatively comfortable at the moment, even though many of its forces, of course, have been fighting in Gaza now for the best part of a year. Reservists have been called up. Many will have done 2 or 3 tours. So there is fatigue. But as I say, I think Israel feels it's got a bit of momentum at the moment.
John, thanks very much. John Donaldson there in Jerusalem, and thanks to Tom Bateman in Washington and Anna Foster in Beirut. Let's stay with what we were listening to from Benjamin Netanyahu, because a little earlier I was speaking to Elon Pinkas, who's the former Israeli Consul General in New York. He was foreign policy advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the former chief of staff to 4 Israeli foreign ministers. He gave me his assessment of Israel's Prime Minister's warning to Iran.
He is warning them, as are the Americans. And there is a case to be made that Mr. Netanyahu has been trying actively, or proactively rather, to lure the Iranians into responding and turn October 7th, almost a year ago, into a regional war, thereby vindicating his narrative that this is a grand civilizational war. On the other side, I don't think that the Iranians are going to fall into that trap. I don't think that Israel really wants that. And an exchange of missiles and attacks is going to could be potentially devastating to both countries. And there's nothing to benefit, and no advantages and no achievements that are conceivable.
But just to pick up on one side of that equation that you said, you think it is a possibility that he's trying to lure Iran into some sort of attack so Israel could respond?
Yes, I think it's a valid premise. For the last 9 or 10 months, if you look at his rhetoric and you look at his flirtations with escalation vis-a-vis Iran, assassinating Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers in Damascus, then assassinating or target assassinating the leader of Hamas's political wing, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran on the day of the presidential inauguration. So there's a case to be made that in his ideal scenario, Iran gets lured into this, and the U.S. then gets dragged into this, and thereby he's turning, in his mind, the calamity of October 7th into some kind of a strategic triumph. That's not going to happen because Iran, until now, as hard as it may be to believe and as hard as it may be for Israelis to admit, Iran has been restrained. And I would not be surprised, Matthew, to find out that the Americans, and I know that some of them already are thinking that their best bet for restraint or de-escalation is right now Iran rather than Israel.
Well, that was Elon Pincas talking to me a little earlier on today's Verified Live. Let me just show you again the live pictures from Beirut, because all the pointers suggesting that ground invasion will start soon. Limited is how that American official described it to the CBS News. The Israeli Defense Minister saying the next phase of the war will begin soon. One more line to bring you. The US envoy to the UN has said that we want to see de-escalation. We do not want to see this spread. But those are the latest comments. These are the latest pictures, with all eyes on the region to see if the Israelis launch this ground invasion. We've seen all of the tanks gathered there at the border and the troops. So we will continue to monitor the situation. We have a variety of picture sources, also all of our teams on the ground to bring you any development as it happens.